name is Kendall, and today I'm going to be sharing with you some of the sexy secrets of fish communication. Now, before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about color. Animals use color in a variety of ways. One of the key ones being communication, such as this poison dart frog, who is using antisemitism to indicate he's very dangerous and don't eat him. Whereas another example, we have this chameleon, who uses it to communicate with his conspecifics and to hide from potential predators. Or even this Indian giant squirrel, who uses the same sort of coloration. But one way that animals communicate with sex is like these peacocks. Communicate with color is like these peacocks, who use this coloration to indicate to potential partners their sex and whether or not they are an ideal mate. Now, with this peacock, we see him showing off his brightly colored feathers to his female friend over there. And when animals have different colorations and patterns, this is what we call sexual dichromatism. Now, of course, there are fish who are sexually dichromatic as well, such as these betas. And now in these fish, much like the peacocks, they have active mate choice and engage in sexual selection. And with betas specifically, the males will build and defend nests for the females to lay their eggs in. That'll be important for later, so keep that in mind. And of course, if we're talking about fish reproduction, we also have to talk about the opposite end of the spectrum, which are the mass spawners. Now these fish have no need for sexually dichromatic color because their gametes do all the work. It doesn't matter to them whether or not they're male or females. They just have to release their eggs or their sperm. But what if you have a fish who doesn't fit this pattern? What if you have a fish who, like the betas, engages in active sexual selection, with males building nests and females laying their eggs in them? But they have the coloration of the red snappers. And that leads me to the damselfish. Because while you might think this might be a rare exception, an odd strategy that has somehow shaken out, we have nearly an entire family of fish who, while they do engage in the behavior patterns we see in sexually dichromatic animals, have what appears to be sexually monochromatic coloration. Now in this image you can see a male and his identical female companions. This is an artificial nest, but it's mimicking the conditions they would have out in the wild. But of course, we said they're sexually monochromatic, but are they actually? Because damselfish see the world a little bit differently, because they can see into the ultraviolet light spectrum. And in fact, they themselves have ultraviolet patterns, which have been shown to play some role in communication. And in this image, you can actually see a damselfish, and then this damselfish under UV light conditions. Now, because humans cannot see UV light, we have to do a little bit of fudging to try and mimic what the fish are seeing. So in this, we measure the intensity of reflectance, with these bright spots being areas where there's a lot of UV light being reflected, and the darker spots being where there's little to no UV reflectance. Now, UV patterns in damselfish have been studied in communication in a few ways. They've been looked at aggression, territoriality, even in individual and species recognition. But my lab thought there might be another role too, which is in the communication of sex. So, are damselfish sexually dichromatic if you can see UV light? And this was what my research looked into, showing, are they dichromatic? And now I specifically looked at Chrysiptera hemicyania, or the azure demoiselle, for this research. Now, the first thing we did was to try and look at the UV patterns and search for any differences between the sexes. So to do this, I built a tank with UV penetrant glass, and I photographed my fish in this aquarium using a camera that had been modified to filter out all light but UV. And this is one of the photos that I was able to take. And with the fish in the tank, unfortunately I didn't have any actual photos of that. So, let's get into the photos that I've taken. This is, once again, like that photo that I showed you before, gray to mimic UV light in a way that humans can process and understand. So, you can see my white patches on the face and upper body region of my fish, and I have an exemplary male and an exemplary female, just for you to be able to compare. So they have the bright spots in the upper body and the face region, and then the darker spots in the caudal and the ventral surface. So, of course, after all of the work put into wrangling my fish, because they do not enjoy being pinched in a photographic tank, we didn't find any consistent or obvious differences between males and females in patterns. But what if it's not the pattern? What if it's the reflectance? Because humans see this. We see the fish as blue and yellow. But fish are perceiving it differently. So we need an objective way to measure color. Now how do we do this? It's the wavelength of light being reflected back to us, but there's also another dimension to it, which is how much of this wavelength is being reflected, or the intensity. We use spectroscopy to measure exactly how much light is being reflected in each wavelength and on various locations of the fish. And we see this as color, but the spectrometer allows us to mathematically look at what is actually happening and just how intense that light is, and including it in the UV spectrum. So here's my data overall. It's a pretty complex graph, so I'm going to break it down a little bit for you. Now along the x-axis here, we have the wavelengths of light measured. We have from 300 to 700, which is both the UV and then the visual light spectrum. We have that helpfully labeled for you with all the different colors related. Then of course along the y-axis, we have the normalized reflectance, which is a pretty standard way of measuring how much light is being reflected at each wavelength. And now I have two graphs. I have the female data and the male data. And for each fish and for each graph, we measured the UV light on 3 locations, which is that blue head, the upper dorsal body, and the ventral body, based on the patterns that we saw in the previous part of my research. And so we're just going to look at the whole graph overall right now and to try and compare the data to what we are seeing as humans. So you can see these peaks on both graphs in around the 470-ish region, and then the 550, which is about blue and green. And as this is a blue and green, bluish fish, this makes sense for what we're seeing. And so, well, the pattern might be the same between males and females. The wavelengths are now what we're looking at, and how intense these are. So let's focus in on that then. So this is a side-by-side comparison of the female and the male data. And this is where things start to get really interesting. Because as you can tell, there's a pretty clear difference between the two. Overall, the males are clearly reflecting a little bit higher, but let's look at this peak here right around 350. That is in the face region for the males and the females. And now we don't know what 350 nanometers of light means, but what we do know is that males are reflecting twice as much light at that specific point than the females are. And so, let's actually look at all of the UV light in general. And here's what we found, is that males are reflecting far more light than the females, and this is statistically significant overall. We looked at the mean normalized reflectance, which is just how much light is being shown in the UV light spectrum right there. So, are damselfish sexually dichromatic if you can see UV light? Signs point to yes, at least based on my research. Of course, this isn't the first time sexual dichromatism has been shown in vertebrates. It's been looked at in a few different bird species, including water terns, but as far as I'm aware, this is the first time that it's been studied in fish. So, future research, I'd love to expand this to even more species because we only looked at Chrysiptera hemicyanea. Could this be just unique for this fish, or for all damsels, or even in a broader range of fish species as well? And of course, behavioral studies. All I've shown is that there is this sexual dichromatism. We have no idea the role it might play in sexual communication or in mate choice. So, I'd like to acknowledge Barry University and our Department of Biology for the funding and support for this project. I'd like to thank Tanusia Burris for his support of the lab. And I'd like to thank you all for coming out today. Thank you very much. My name is once again Kendall Hovs, and I'm a current senior at Barry University. I'll be graduating this December, and I am looking for grad school positions. If you or anyone you know has any spot, you can find more about me at my personal website at that QR code. Thank you for your time.